Hello and welcome to the Idea Studio's badging video for our Prusa 3D printers. We have here one of our printers currently working on a print job. So the way a 3D printer works is it takes a roll of plastic filament. We have many colors available to pick from. That filament gets loaded down into the print head where it is melted. As it's melted, it's drawing it out on the build plate here in the pattern that matches the design that you've loaded onto your SD card. It's working its way up layer by layer, doing one layer at a time until it has finished the completed print. We'll start by going over the basic parts of the machine. So as mentioned, there's rolls of plastic filament that hang on the rack here. They just slide loosely on and off. There's space for 2 rolls, even though the printer only prints in one color. This way you can keep a spare roll handy if you should be needing to use it. The filament then goes down into the print head, and as mentioned, the print head melts it. The print head gets extremely hot during a print. So especially the underside here, you want to keep your hands away from it. You can burn yourself quite easily. So just always be aware of the print head and do not touch it. The build plate is the surface that the print is being created on. So as the 3D printer is melting the filament, it's drawing it out on the build plate. So your model is being built on this surface here. The build plate is also heated during a print job. It's not as hot as the print head, but again, just be careful because this is a hot surface and you want to be careful around it. The build plate is removable. So when your print is done, it'll be on this build plate. You will then remove the build plate from the machine and then remove the print from the build plate. So never try to remove your print while the build plate is still in place. Always take it off first and then remove your print from the build plate. There's 2 corners under here. You can put your fingers under to remove it. So you just lift up. It's magnetic, so it just pops right off. So then you would take this aside, remove your print, and then return it into position. To replace the build plate, if you look at it, you notice there's this notch on the back edge here. This notch lines up with 2 pins on the machine to orient the build plate so you can put it back in place properly. The 2 pins are on the back edge of the heat bed. So there's a pin right here and a pin right here. Those 2 pins line up with the 2 corners of your notch. So to put the build plate back in place, I orient it against those 2 pins. So I've got a pin in this corner. So I've got a pin in this corner and a pin in that corner. And now I want to be careful not to trap my fingers as I'm lowering the build plate. The magnets are quite strong. So I moved my fingers to just being in the very corners here and then drop it down. You'll notice it comes down quite quickly and that I'm keeping my fingers in the very corners here. It's possible if you have a finger in here to pinch it as it comes down. It's not going to cut your finger off, but it will be uncomfortable. A couple other things to know about the build plate. One thing, it is flexible. So when I take it off, you can see it can flex slightly. When you finish your print job, the print job is stuck onto this build plate firmly. Usually the easiest way to get it off is just to gently flex the plate either inward or outward. You're not trying to bend the plate, you're just lightly flexing to cause the print to pop off. You'll also notice there's a thin film of glue on the surface of the build plate, on this side, but not on this side. When you put the build plate down, you want to make sure the glue side is up. The glue helps the print job adhere to the build plate. Also, so important that it's written directly on the machine itself, is never print on the heat bed without the build plate in place. So never print directly onto this surface. Always make sure you put the build plate back in place, glue side up. You also want to make sure that there's no dust or debris or anything on here that will get trapped between the build plate and the heat bed when you put it back in place. So glue side up, nothing on here. Line up with your 2 pins in the back, watch your fingers, drop it into place. Another thing to be aware of, both for your own safety and for the safety of the machine, is what things you should be careful to avoid touching. So we talked about how the print head heats up and you want to avoid touching that while the printer is heated. The print bed also heats up, so again, be careful and avoid touching that. The print head is moving back and forth, up and down. The print bed is moving forward and backwards. So these metal rods here are what's moving things around. So avoid touching the rods, avoid touching anything that's moving. Generally speaking, all you have to touch is the filament loaded into the top of the print head and then use the control panel and button down here. The control panel is operated by a combined button and wheel. So this turns and it can also be pressed. When I press it, I bring up my menu. As I turn it, you'll notice I'm scrolling down through the menu with each click that I'm turning it. And then I can scroll back up again. At the very top option here, you see this little back arrow here. That means that clicking on this takes me back to my previous level. So I click on that, and now I'm back to the info screen. I can click again to bring the menu up. These little arrows along the side means that there's a further menu. So if I went to Preheat and clicked on it, I have a further menu. So I have things to pick from here. The top option always brings me up a level. So now I can go back to this menu And now I'm back to the information screen. When I click to bring up my main menu, the first options on the screen are the ones that I use most often. So info screen, my top option, when I click on that, takes me back to this screen here. Then preheat, print from SD card, load filament, and unload filament. These four are the ones that we use for regular printing. The first thing I generally want to do is to preheat my printer. Preheating is necessary before I can unload filament. So unless the printer is already loaded with the color filament I happen to want to use, I'm going to preheat it, unload the filament that's currently in there, load the filament that I want, and then begin my print job. So I go to my main menu and I select Preheat. PLA, this first option here, is the kind of plastic that we stock. PLA stands for polylactic acid. It's a corn-based biodegradable filament. That is the filament that all of our filament is, so I don't have to worry about which one to do. I just go straight down to PLA, click on it, and it starts preheating. Once I have the printer in preheat mode, this first set of numbers on the main display screen become relevant. These numbers are telling me the current temperature and the desired temperature for the print head and the heat bed. So currently the print head is at 106 degrees Celsius and it's trying to reach 215. The heat bed is currently 41 degrees Celsius and it's going for 60 degrees. So these two numbers on this side will increase until they match the numbers on that side. When they get there, you've reached preheat mode. There's no beep, no alarm, nothing to tell you when you've come up to temperature. You just have to keep an eye on these numbers until they match those numbers over there. The printer has to be preheated before you can unload or load filament. So generally speaking, when you come in to use the printer, the first thing you do is you put it in preheat mode so it can start heating up and you can then get ready to load and unload your filament. It is, however, not safe for the printer to stay in preheat mode for long periods of time. In fact, there's an automatic safety shutoff. If you put it in preheat, forget about it and walk away, it will turn itself off again. So actually we're there right now, we're at 2:15. So when you come in, you want to put it in preheat mode, but then don't walk away for half an hour. So put it in preheat mode shortly before you're ready to start loading and unloading. You notice it's actually overheating a little bit. Sometimes it does that and then it'll come back down and equalize. So we are now ready to unload our filament. Once I'm at temperature in preheat mode, I'm ready to unload. So I push my button. I'm going to scroll down to unload, which is my fourth option. I click on it, and when I do that, you'll notice the filament starts to back out of the print head. So I click on it. You can see that pulling out. It beeps loudly, which means to pull it out the rest of the way. Now before I let go of this, I'm going to clip the end. So you see how the end is kind of gnarly looking? So I'm going to trim it at a 45-degree angle. So not straight on, but at a 45-degree angle. Trim my end. And then take this roll off the rack. And I'm still hanging on to the end. You don't want to ever let go of the end of a roll of filament or the entire roll can unwind and cause a horrible mess. So I'm hanging on to this. And there are holes in various places around the edge. So I'm just going to find a hole, stick the end of my filament through it, and that keeps it secure so the roll doesn't unwind. I'm now done with this roll. I'll just put it back on here for keeping, and I'm ready to load my next color. When I'm ready to load a new filament color, there's two things I want to check for. The first thing I want to see is to make sure that the previous user was a nice, thoughtful person and trimmed the end of their filament. If they didn't, I'm going to take my clippers and go ahead and get a nice clean end on that so it's ready to load in. Then, again, hanging onto my end, I pull it out. So I've got it trapped here so it doesn't unwind. And I want to make sure I put it on the spool holder the right way. So the filament, when I put it on this way, the filament is coming off the top of the roll. That's the proper way. When I put it on upside down, the filament is feeding off the bottom of the roll. It doesn't feed as well that way. So I always want to make sure I have it so that the filament is coming off the top of the roll. So clean end coming off the top of the roll. Then I take my end and I insert it in the hole at the top of the print head here until it won't go any further. So I put it in nice and firmly there. Now I go down here, I push my button, and I'm going to load filament. So I scroll down, and I always put my hand on here just so I can feel to make sure that it starts loading. So when I push load, you can see my hand is getting pulled in. So the filament is now being sucked into the machine. It's going to start to heat that. It's going to start to extrude out the bottom, starting with the original color of orange. So there comes my orange. And now it's going to slowly change color until it turns from the orange to the purple. So it's clearing out the leftover pieces of the orange and it's turning to purple. Now you can see it's a lot more purple. So it asks, did the filament extrude with the correct color? You can say yes or no. If you say no, it'll just keep extruding more until you get the right color. I happen to have purple, so I'm good, so I click on yes, and my filament is loaded and ready to go.
The software Prusa uses is called Ultimaker Cura. Ultimaker Cura is available on all Idea Studio laptops. You can also search and download Cura for free online. When you first open Cura, this is what your workspace is going to look like. The first thing you want to make sure to do is select the proper printer. Both our Prusa and Ultimaker printers use the program Cura. This is something you can check by going under Settings and making sure that the proper printer is selected. Once Prusa is selected as your printer, you can go ahead and bring in your design. You can go to File and Open File, or you can click on this file folder icon. So we'll go ahead and click on that folder and make sure that the file that we're using is an STL file. We want to make sure that any files that we're bringing into Cura are STL. Let's go ahead and open up that file. So this is what it looks like in our workspace. And over here on the left, a grayed out tool panel has appeared. You won't be able to select things right away, but we'll show you how to do that as we move forward in this video. And in the bottom left-hand corner, the name of your file appears. You can change it if you'd like, but we'll keep it the same for now. And under that, you're given the dimensions of your design in millimeters. Right under that, there are options to change the view of your design. So you can go ahead and click on this and change the perspective of your 3D print. So this is front facing, top facing, and a few other options for you. If you're using a mouse, a quick tip is scrolling in and out allows you to zoom in and out of your design. Another mouse tip for you, you can also change the perspective of your design by right-clicking and dragging your mouse. So I'm just taking a look at my design by clicking and zooming in and out of it. And if it gets too confusing doing this and you want a cleaner view of your design, you can go ahead and click on one of the boxes again in the bottom left-hand corner. If you take a look in the right-hand corner, there's a slice option. By clicking this, you'll be given an estimated print time for your design. Without making any changes to my design, the print time comes to 1 hour and 13 minutes. This is likely to change as you make changes to your design. We can play around with the toolbar on the left once we click on the design. Now the tools are ready to select. The first option is the Move tool, and with this you'll be able to change the position of your design. Notice the arrows that appear. If you click and drag these arrows, they'll move along the selected axis. So I can click on the green arrow, allowing it to move along the y-axis. And it will show you how many millimeters in the move box. If I select the red arrow, it moves it along the x-axis. Now I can try to move it up, but it will just drop back down to the surface. I can also manually enter the position I want my print in the move box. And now it's back to its original position. Like I mentioned before, the toolbar options are only available when you click on your design. So anytime you click out of it, just click back on your design to make these options available. This next option on the toolbar is the scale option. So I can click and drag these colored lines like I did with the move lines. Only it will change the size of my design. So I can make it bigger or I can make it smaller this way. I can also manually insert the size I want by changing the percentage back to 100. The proportions are able to stay equal when the uniform scaling box is selected. I can also insert my own dimensions if I'd like as well. Now let's see what happens if I unclick the uniform scaling option and change the size of the design only on the y-axis. Everything else stayed the same size except for the changes I made, so it's no longer proportionate. Because I like my design proportionate, I will just undo this option, but how your design looks is completely up to you. The next option we have is the rotate option. So if I click on that, colored rings will appear around your design. I can click and drag on these rings to adjust the angle of my design. So by clicking on the green ring, I'm adjusting the angle on the y-axis. And by clicking on the red, I'm adjusting the angle on the x-axis. So I'm just kind of playing around with these rings, but I'm probably going to keep my design as it was before. The last option we'll look at is the mirror option. This option allows you to flip your design in the opposite direction. If it's pretty symmetrical, it may not do much with the appearance. Once you're satisfied with the appearance of your design, you can now take a look at your print settings. Print settings are in the upper right portion of your page. If you click on it, a print settings display panel appears. These are the recommended print settings for your design. The profile selected is the quality of your design. The thinness or thickness of your filament layer is determined by the profile. The smaller the number, the higher the quality. However, the higher the quality, the longer the print time. So I can pick a thicker filament layer if I wanted a shorter print time, but I would have a lower quality print. Infill is the structure inside your design. The higher the percentage, the stronger the inside of your print is. At 100%, your design is solid. The lower the percentage, the more hollow it is. Now we can take a look at supports. Supports are generated structures that support any overhangs underneath your design. A good way in determining whether or not your design needs supports is seeing if there are any red areas underneath the design, so you can see that there's space between this overhang underneath the monkey's face and the build plate. So you want to look for red areas and overhangs on your design. This is going to show you that you do want supports underneath your print so that it doesn't collapse while it is being printed. The adhesion option allows your print to stay put on the build plate while printing. Without adhesion, such as a brim or a raft, there's a chance your design will shift or lift off the build plate, ruining your print. Depending on the look of your print, you may not need adhesion, but it's best to select it just to be safe. These are the recommended print settings. If you want to customize your own, you can select Custom, which pulls up various options for you to go in and manually adjust. By going into Profile, I can select the size of my filament layer, so it's 0.15 millimeters right now. I can also go into Quality, and it still says it's 0.15 millimeters for the layer height. The Infill option allows you to adjust the density of the inside of your print. If I go into Infill, it says my infill percentage is at 20%, and I want to change that to 50%. So it's suggesting lines for my infill pattern. Certain infill patterns may be better for certain prints, but I'll go ahead and select Grid just for fun. You can customize the supports on your design as well by selecting the placement or the overhang angle. Changing this can affect the time of your print and the structure of your supports. Now let's take a look at each build plate adhesion option. We have the skirt, brim, or raft. We'll start out by selecting the brim option. Once brim is selected, I want a preview of how the brim is going to look on my design. I'm going to go under Preview and just make sure that my layer view option is selected. and then I'm going to go over to slice. Once I click on that, that gives me a layer view of my design. By selecting brim, you're going to add a single layer flat area around your design. It will help keep the print down on the build plate and prevent the design from warping. Now we can see what the skirt option looks like. I'll go ahead and select slice again. Now the skirt option is a line printed around the model. It actually doesn't touch the model or keep the model in its position during a print. It primes the extruder, but other than that, it doesn't do much to help the model stay put. The strongest adhesion option is going to be the raft. I'm going to go ahead and select raft and slice. The raft adds a thick grid with a roof below the model. The raft is built first before the print, helping the print stay in place as it's being built on top of the raft. This is a good option for larger prints as well as prints with longer print times. Now let's say I'm satisfied with my design and I want to print it. If I look over at my slice area, it says that my print is going to take 2 hours and 19 minutes. I want to shorten this time, so I'm going to change the build plate adhesion to a brim. And I'm going to change the infill back to 20%. Once I select slice, now my print time is at 1 hour and 41 minutes. If I'm satisfied with this, I can get ready to save my print onto an SD card. Now I'll go back into the Prepare tab to get another look at my design. If everything looks good, I can go ahead and change the name of my print file to something easy for me to find when I insert my SD card into the Prusa. So I'll go ahead and change the name. Once you insert your SD card into your computer, the Save to Removable Drive option will appear. You can click on this and the design will be saved and ready to print.
Now that I have my desired color of filament loaded, I'm ready to start a print. So to do that, I take the SD card out of the side of the machine here, I take this over to my laptop, save my file onto it, and then insert it back into the slot on the side. When you insert the SD card, it automatically brings up that menu. The most recently saved file will be the one at the top. So the file that you just added to the SD card should be your first one on here. So I simply scroll down until I get to the top one. I click my button, and now it's starting doing that print for me. Now the first thing it has to do, even though it says heating, it's actually cooling. You'll notice it preheats to a hotter temperature than it prints at. It preheats to 215, it prints at 210. So it has to cool down a little bit to get to its printing temperature. Now it's going to calibrate its print head. So to do that, it's going to move to 9 different places on the build plate just to check to be sure the build plate is smooth and level. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth until it's checked all 9 places on the build plate. Then it moves to the front corner here and it's going to run a test strip just to make sure the filament is extruding properly. So you can see at first nothing came out and now we've got the purple filament coming out. If you don't see anything on here by the time it's done, then there's something wrong. You need to stop the print and figure out why it's not extruding. Now that it's done, it's just starting, so it's going to draw out the first layer on the build plate, fill in anything that needs filled in, move up a tiny bit, do the next layer, and keep going as it's working through the print job until your file is finished. There's a couple things you want to be aware of during a print. You don't have to sit here and watch the print the entire time, but you want to keep an eye on it occasionally to see if anything is going wrong. Sometimes, for instance, as it's printing along, the print will actually start to lift up off the build plate, sometimes just in a small corner, sometimes the whole thing will break loose. This particular print, for instance, is a famous example of what happens when you lose build plate adhesion. So it was printing along just fine and then it broke loose and started moving around all over the place during the print. So always check to make sure that you are still stuck down to the build plate. If it breaks loose, there's a couple things that might have gone wrong. One thing is you might need to add in your slicing software build plate adhesion. Either enable a raft, enable a brim, something to help it stay in place while you're printing. If you have a raft or a brim and it's still lifting up, it might just be that we need to replace the glue on the build plate. So let a staff member know. We'll take a look at it, wash the build plate off, and put fresh glue on it. So that's one thing to just check occasionally to make sure you're still stuck down. Another thing to check is that your print is printing the way you expect it to print. Sometimes people forget to add supports or something like that, and the print about halfway through starts looking really, really weird. This is an example of a print. It started out like this, and it needed supports and didn't have it, and so it started printing spaghetti. So if you see anything weird happening, stop the print and try to figure out what's going wrong. Most of the time, the printer does just fine. Most prints work out, but just be aware that while the printer is printing, just check on it occasionally to see what it's doing. While it's printing, we still have the same information here. We have our temperature of our print head, temperature of the heat bed, and then SD 0%. This is telling you how far into the print it has progressed so far. This is a fairly lengthy print, so we have done 0%, but it'll keep counting up on that until it gets to 100% when we're done. Then the number right across from it says that we've been printing for 3 minutes already. That will continue to count up also until the print is done. Z 0.2, that tells you the current height of the print head above the build plate. So as each layer goes up, that number will increase as the print head moves up. Then this 100% here, that's telling you the speed at which it is printing. You might think that 100% is as fast as it can go. It's actually not. Suppose I wanted to speed this print up. I just spin my wheel, and now you see this number starts going up. And my print head is now moving faster. So now it's going at 268%. And it can go all the way up to 999%. You can also send it back down again to very slow. Now it's at 44% of its normal speed. You can see how much slower it is traveling now. 100% is usually your best bet. If you go too fast, you lose a little bit of precision in the print job. If you go too slow, obviously it takes forever to print. But this is something that you can play around with. If you want to adjust your print speed in the middle of a print, you just spin this wheel while it's printing, and that will adjust in there. So now we'll just let the printer work for a while. If something goes wrong and you need to abort a print in the middle, like if your build plate adhesion breaks loose or you have to stop it for some reason, you push this button here, and I'm going to scroll down to Stop Print. It asks me, are you sure? I say, yes, I'm sure. I click on it, and now it aborts the print. Now you'll notice it only moved the print head up a very small amount. I'm going to have a hard time getting this out with just that little bit of space in there. At any time, if I push and hold this button, I get this Z option, and now when I turn the wheel, my print head moves up. So I can do that until I've got enough space to easily take the build plate out and then remove my print from it. Now this is such a very flat piece, it's only one layer, it's not going to come off easily if I flex the plate. In this case, I usually need to use a tool to chisel it off. When I'm using a tool, I have a couple options to choose from. This one right here, as you can see, has very sharp corners. This is a no-no to use on the Prusa. This is good for some other of our 3D printers, but you do not use a sharp cornered tool on the Prusa. This one has nice round corners. This is good for use on the Prusa. So I would then just get under it, chisel this off, make sure I take my test strip off, any other pieces I have on here, line this back up, drop it in place, and I'm ready to start again. You'll notice it automatically started cooling down. Whenever I abort a print, it starts cooling back down again. When I start another print, it will go back and preheat itself, so I do not have to go back to preheat mode if I'm immediately starting another print. I only have to preheat if I wanted to change the filament before I start my next print. So here we have a print job ready to be taken off the printer. Once the printer is finished, it cools itself down automatically, so you don't have to worry about putting the printer in cool down mode. Once it's done, it starts cooling down all by itself. Sometimes you want to move the print head up to get a little more space in here to make it easier to take the print off. So to do that, you just press and hold this button like we talked about. When your Z-axis comes up, you spin the wheel, the print head raises. If you need a little more space, you can spin it some more, it'll raise some more. Then you put your fingers under these two corners here, lift, and your build plate comes off. Now to get your print off, usually all you have to do is simply flex the plate, and you can see that now it just lifts right off. Sometimes flexing it inward helps a little bit, and again, you're not trying to like bend the plate, you're just flexing it slightly. If it's a thin print or a flat print, sometimes that doesn't work, and then again, you need to use a tool, and just always be sure to use one that has rounded corners, not sharp corners. So now I'm going to make sure there's nothing on here that's going to get trapped when I put my build plate back on. And I've got the notch here, I'm lining up with my 2 pins. So I slide it into place, I watch my fingers, drop it down, and that's ready to go. Now, when you saved your file on the SD card, we don't delete those off very often. So it's whenever we next happen to clean the SD card off. So if your file is important to you, you don't want other people to have access to it, you can take the SD card out, take it to your laptop, delete your file off it, and then just bring the SD card back and slide it right back into that slot. So you've taken your print off, you throw any scraps away, including the little test strip it does across the front of the build plate. If you're interested, you delete the file off of the SD card. You can leave the filament loaded for the next person, you don't have to unload it. So everything's good, cleaned up, ready to go, and you have successfully completed a 3D print.